Well, welcome students. We're going to return to this idea of what is diversity and really look at some data sets now to really understand what it is that can actually impact diversity in ways that can promote diversity, or in some cases what can actually reduce diversity. And so we're going to look at these data sets and look at graphs and figures from real studies from the scientific literature. And so as we do that, it's important to kind of use a couple of steps when we're trying to interpret graphs. And so here's a couple of guiding questions that if you do this throughout the semester, this may be a helpful way for you to think about how to interpret graphs. And so the first thing to do is to look at the axes and think to yourself, do you know what the graph is actually trying to tell you? What is it reporting to you? And how are the data actually presented? Once you have an idea for that, then you can start to look for patterns inside the graph itself. Is there a high point? Is there a low point? Does it go up? Does it go down? Is there a peak somewhere? Okay. And then from there, you can start to put those pieces together and be able to draw conclusions. Well, based on what the axes are reporting, and I see this general trend, then I have an idea of what the key findings of their study are. And clearly in this particular case, we can draw conclusions as they relate to diversity. What factors and how are they actually impacting diversity? And so we're going to be going through and talking about 8 different studies and how they have reported that diversity can be impacted by these several different factors. So our first study is by Brown and Fridley, and it was published in 2003. And so for this particular study, the authors constructed about 175 by 75 centimeter plots in a grassland system in North Carolina. And so each plot first started out as completely bare soil, and the researchers would then plant 3 different levels of seed richness. And you can see the different levels of seed richness are right here. They had either 3 species, 10 species, or 30 species. In addition, they had 3 different levels of seed density. So as you can see here, they had very, very low levels at 10 seeds, they had 100 seeds, and then they went all the way up to 1,000 seeds. And they planted, the seeds were native grasses and forbs of the area. They also had a control plot that they left completely bare, and they never planted any seeds, and the data for those are not actually shown on this particular graph. And so what they did is they sowed all their seeds at the different densities or different species richness, and they left them for about 6 weeks and went back. And after they had been there growing for about 6 weeks, they then measured the species richness of all those same species on each plot. So as you can clearly see, there's some really interesting patterns. So the first thing you can see is that when you actually sow more seeds, they overall tend to have greater species richness. So starting out with a greater number of species can actually promote or maintain greater species richness. In addition, you can clearly see that if you especially look at this one where we started out with 30 species, that there's kind of this peak where this is the optimal number or the optimal density of seeds, and that it quickly declines as we increase the seed density. And so clearly we have these general patterns. First, lower seed density means greater diversity, and second, if we actually have higher original seed richness, then we actually have greater diversity in general. So these are 2 good patterns that we can see in this study and often promotes in others. Density is a major factor, and having more species to start out with can really contribute to improving diversity. So this is a second study I wanted to talk about, and that's by Rash and Others, and it was published in 2005. And so for this particular study, the authors collected bacterial communities from 11 high mountain lakes that were from varying sizes in Spain. And they went in and they identified unique different bacterial colonies and identified species by genetic fingerprinting. And all of their results are in these closed circles you can see down here. They also compared their studies with results from different areas throughout the world, and these other studies were presented in the open circles and the asterisks. And they like to have this incorporation of these other studies because, as you can clearly see, these were much larger lakes. And so as you can see, the general pattern is that if we look at lake size, which is on this axis, that as we increase the lake area, we also increase the species richness of bacteria. So we have this positive relationship. And so our general take-home message is, as we have larger areas, we have greater diversity. And that makes some sense because in a larger area, you have more resources to go around. So that allows for more different species to come in and colonize. So the third study was published by Bruno and O'Connor in 2005. And so for this particular study, the authors maintained several large fish aquaria outside in North Carolina. And they were trying to simulate what it was like in the South Atlantic communities, where there's many different species of algae, there's some herbivores, and some fish. And so what they were trying to do was to understand if we have each tank, which started with the same number and volume of plants and herbivores, and they simply manipulated the number of predators if they could see some relationship in terms of the total number of species richness of plants. And it's worth noting that most of the predators were strict carnivores, meaning they only ate herbivores and they didn't eat plants. Pinfish was the one example that was not the case. They actually were omnivorous, so they would eat herbivores, but they also eat algae. In addition, most of these predators were generalists, meaning they would eat whatever, but there was a couple of these, like the crabs, that were specialists, and they really only ate a few things. They, just like the isopods, they had a harder time actually catching the amphipods. And so if we look to see what they actually found, you can clearly see some really interesting patterns. Here's their control, where they actually had no predators at all, and you can see that's actually the lowest number of species. So actually the number of plants that occurred in a community when you had no top predators was pretty low. As we started to introduce, or they introduce, individual species into the mix, you can clearly see we actually increase the number of species of algae. In these two cases where it's actually still fairly low, again, these are the ones that are specialists. They really try to only eat, or in some cases only have the option to only eat, a few kinds of herbivores. Whereas you can clearly see that with the generalists, that was where the species richness was the highest in the algae, because there was these generalists, they would eat whatever. In addition, we could also see that the number of species, if you actually increased those and had several of them, that was not a good thing. And so interactions matter. That's clearly an important piece. And we can also see that having just few generalist predators promotes that diversity. As we stack up the number of species, 3, 5 species, that can be a bad thing. So the next study that we have is published by Lennon and colleagues in 2000. And so for this particular study, the authors used the presence and absence of birds that occurred in the British mainland and some of the surrounding islands. And they did this, and they actually determined a map of the species richness of birds across the entire area. And so birds were segregated into 2 general categories. The first was species richness of what they referred to as these summer residents, or SR. And so those were there most of the year, but it was primarily they were in those regions in the summer. And that's, of course, in contrast to what they considered the winter residents, where those were, again, there for whenever part of the year, but primarily in the winter time. And then what they did is they overlaid that map of species distributions onto a map of mean monthly temperature of the study area, which was between May and July. And the data was compiled in these large quadrats. And so each individual quadrat had both a mean summer monthly temperature, which you can see again on this independent axis, versus the diversity of bird species. And so you can actually see the really interesting conclusion, and it didn't really matter whether it was summer or winter residents. You get the same positive linear correlation that as you increase summer temperatures, you actually increase the bird diversity. And so we can clearly see that warmer summer temperatures has or promotes greater diversity. I should also note here that although it's not shown in their study, there's often a very similar correlation that we can see with moisture. And that is that when you tend to have more moisture, you tend to have greater diversity. And both of these factors, both temperature and moisture, kind of are getting at the same thing of having more resources available to whatever species that we're talking about, in this case birds. And both of those factors tend to create more resources, which then promotes diversity of, in this case, birds. So now the 5th study that I wanted us to talk about was by Patterson and colleagues, and it was published in 1998. And so the authors in this study compiled distribution data of birds and bats in an area in southeastern Peru. And so the data that they chose were pooled into kind of little areas or elevational bands that were about 250 meters wide along this elevation gradient. And so the gradient started about 450 meters in kind of lowland forests, and so that was at the low end of their axis. And then as it kind of increases, it goes through montane forests and then cloud forests near about 1,400 meters. And then finally, above 2,800 meters was replaced by elfin forests, these little kind of short canopy forests. And so they looked at these two different species, birds and bats, because they share fairly similar niches. They're both flying, they both are similar in size, and they kind of like the same food resources. And as you can see, there's very similar patterns, and that is that in general, as we increase the elevation, so we're getting higher and higher and higher on the mountain, you actually see fewer and fewer and fewer birds, or in this case, down here, bats. And again, that's the same idea with the amount of resources. As you tend to go up in elevation, it tends to get colder, and it tends to get not nearly as moist, and so it does not promote diversity. And so overall, we can see that at lower elevation sites, we tend to indeed have greater diversity because it's at lower elevations that in general have more available resources.